Hello, I'm Dr. Brett Kawada. I'm with the CHEC Center, and today I'm going to talk to you about cultural humility, empathy, and compassion, otherwise known as CHEC. So CHEC is actually a rendition of Tervalon and Murray Garcia's original work that was called Cultural Humility. It was really started out in a paper that was published in 1998 that really kind of talk about the differences between cultural humility as well as cultural competence. As you've probably heard of if you're watching this video, cultural competence has been a really big, powerful movement to help people really with the knowledge base around different cultures, understanding how to interact with different cultures. Tervalon and Murray Garcia thought that this was a great movement, and they really wanted to get their practitioners educated that way. And so they ran their folks through a training program, which really got them what they would consider to be culturally competent, a lot of training. However, they were finding that we were having problems, that many of their practitioners' scores as far as providing good service was actually going down. And so they thought that they needed to do something a little bit different. So what they found was that the practitioners from this big knowledge base were making generalizations about the individual patient that they were treating, the clients that they were treating. And from these generalizations, they were making some pretty big mistakes. So Tervalon and Murray Garcia thought they needed to do something else and really flip this upside down. And so they came up and developed cultural humility, which has three main components. The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. The second is recognizing and challenging power imbalances. And then the third is institutional accountability. So let's go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. So the first, lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. So this is very different from kind of a cultural competence. This really suggests that you kind of flip this upside down. Instead of knowing everything about somebody's culture, their cultural background, they actually understand it in a different way that they know that they don't know. So this really kind of connects to that humility piece, that we don't really know about somebody's individual culture. So when we talk about culture from a CHEC perspective, we're really talking about individual culture, that we're not generalizing because we really don't know without conversation. So what does that look like? So if you think about this for a second, individuals, for example, you might have a family and you might even have two identical twins. And those twins were born and raised in the same family, which basically gives them a lot of their family culture, their family history, all of that stuff. Also, they have a lot of the same genetic and biological makeup. So here they are, identical twins, so you would think biologically they would be the same. However, I've seen quite a few twins who are not the same at all, and in fact, do not necessarily identify with their family culture in the same way, and could potentially be seen as almost like polar opposites to some degree. So in that case, to make a generalization, even about one, that, oh, you were born and raised in this family, so your twin must have the same thoughts and feelings maybe about their own culture. If they were, maybe their culture is a Japanese culture. Maybe one identifies with the Japanese culture and really, really looks back at kind of some of the historical stuff with their own family, identifies with some of the traditional Japanese practices, and then the other person might absolutely know nothing about the Japanese culture. For example, for me, my ancestry is Japanese, so half Japanese. If you were to ask me, well, Brett, you're Japanese, you must know about the tea ceremony. I would have to say, sorry, I think that there's tea and there's some kind of ceremony, but that's about all I know about it. And so to make those kinds of assumptions and generalizations really starts to put us in a problematic place. So Tervalon and Murray Garcia said this is got to be different. It's got to be flipped upside down to the point where we know that we don't know. So by knowing we don't know, we always are pushing for this lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, understanding that we're never going to fully get everything, especially when we're talking about individual culture. It also pushes us to be curious about that, so that we don't necessarily be curious about the general culture, right? So if you're curious about the tea ceremony and you ask me, you're going to be asking a question that I'm not going to know. I'll probably feel a little weird. You're going to feel weird as well. And so instead, we ask about your personal connection to the Japanese culture. Then I can tell you, oh, well, you know, my grandma was Japanese and cooked a lot of Japanese food. And that was really important, to me growing up, that we had some Japanese food here and there. But the strength of that connection to traditional Japanese culture is kind of faded away throughout the generations of being here. So the next thing, so that really pushes us to know that we don't know, and really says that we have to reflect critically. So we reflect critically upon ourselves throughout this whole process, really recognizing, if I want to know about the Japanese tea ceremony, I'm going to go out and research it. I'm going to study it. Those types of things where you can go back to cultural competence, the knowledge base behind this, and utilize your cultural competence through research and understanding of the generalized culture. Then you can ask more specific questions if you feel like it's necessary, depending on where you're utilizing this. But it gets us to that space of lifelong learning and critical self-reflection, always looking back upon ourselves, understanding where our gaps in knowledge are, and then filling those in through research and education. So the next is recognizing and challenging power imbalances. So one of the big things that they really focused on is that there is inherent power differentials in all relationships that we have, especially within different organizational structures. And so you can imagine what power kind of does to relationships and the way that you connect with the people around you. So imagine that you're maybe at a work party and you're sitting there talking with your coworkers, maybe you're talking about work or something like that, and the next thing you know, the boss walks in the room. What does that feel like? Probably the conversation changed. Probably people kind of got a little maybe uncomfortable, or their conversation kind of switched from this topic to, oh yeah, how about those Mariners or something like that, right? That power that just was introduced to the space all of a sudden changed the dynamics in my classroom setting. So I am also a professor of psychology. I start off by really trying to not have such a big power dynamic in the classroom, because I truly believe that the best way for the students to learn is to have me as an accessible tool for learning. If I have this big presence that's really intimidating and scary, then the students are probably not going to come to me if they have questions, or they're going to feel really anxious around me, or maybe they're not going to raise their hand in classes because they don't feel comfortable. And so by shifting and changing that power dynamic, I can then have more of a connection with my students. They can feel more authentic with me, and I can feel more authentic with them. And that, in my opinion, really helps the dynamic of the classroom and the learning environment altogether. So just some examples of recognizing and challenging power imbalances. The other place is when you look at systems, the different systems that you kind of find yourself a part of, that it's really important to know when you are in a position of power and the responsibility that you have with that power to really advocate for the folks who may or may not have the same amount of power that you've got. So it's really understanding, and a lot of times you can do simple things like look at the table, who's there, but really bigger, who's not at the table. Why are they not at the table? Is there something that you could do to get people at the table so that you can be inclusive of all voices? If there's systems that are in place that are inherently oppressing different folks within the organization, it's important that if you're in a position of power to be able to call out and challenge those things. Now, you of course have to be mindful of how you do it. You have to think about the long-term ramifications, but it really asks us to do that. As people, we're the system. I think a lot of times we think of the system as this thing that's out here that we just can't influence. It's its own thing running by itself. No, we're actually the system. So that means that if we want change in the system, we've got to do something. We've got to advocate. And when we're in that position of power, that's our responsibility. The last thing is really institutional accountability. So the first part of institutional accountability is this sense of being able to, as an institution, push this philosophy forward. So if this comes from the top-down way of thinking, so if the president is practicing cultural humility all the way down, then you know part of cultural humility is about getting to know folks, right? Making that connection, being a little bit deeper with that connection, being authentic in the way you represent and present yourself. If you open yourself up like that, you could potentially be vulnerable. So being vulnerable means that somebody could take your information and maybe use that to hurt you. If you have a closed group that you're practicing cultural humility with, you can feel safe. However, if you walk through the door and all of a sudden you're in the bigger institution and you don't know who is practicing cultural humility, you kind of open yourself up for potential pain, right? That you're vulnerable and somebody could use that information against you. However, if the institution really adapts this cultural humility perspective. And it really comes from the top down. You're more likely to walk out of that space and recognize that you're still in an institution that practices cultural humility. So that sense of being able to be vulnerable, to connect with people at a deeper level, all of those things are still going to be there for you. The other thing is that institutions have accountability to the communities that they represent or that they find themselves impacting or connecting with. And so institutions themselves must practice cultural humility at an institutional level. So what does that mean as far as their impact to the community? How are they learning about the community? How are they understanding at a cultural level from the individual communities that they impact? Because we know that when we talk about the community, we're not just talking about one thing, we're talking about groups put together that all, I guess we call it a community altogether, but we're a part of that as an institution. So the institution needs to practice cultural humility, that lifelong learning, critical self-reflection, that recognizing and challenging power imbalances within the community, and then that institutional accountability, hopefully pushing that cultural humility forward out into the community. So you can see how this could potentially grow and be big. So this was my adaptation of Tervalon and Murray Garcia's original work. From there, I really enjoyed this, and I really thought that it really resonated with me. The big thing was kind of the difference between cultural competence and cultural humility. I always felt uncomfortable in spaces with other folks that I know had done a lot of studying and research and were very, very up to speed with their cultural competence. In spaces like that, I found myself not participating, not offering my own perspectives because I felt like I wasn't culturally competent. Cultural competence almost has this suggestion, just by the terminology, you're either culturally competent or you're culturally incompetent, potentially. And if you're not culturally competent, you're probably feeling fairly incompetent. And so what does that do? It doesn't allow individuals maybe the access to or the freedom to actually express what their thoughts are. So I kind of find myself in that position. And when I heard cultural humility, I really liked it. I thought, oh, you know what? This is a really different way to approach a very, very important topic. So from there, I started to try to practice this more. What I found was that there was a little bit missing in the practice, and it really came down to empathy and compassion. That empathy and compassion were the two big things that we really needed in order to do this. Now, there's a whole bunch of other stuff as well, but if you're able to attend one of our CHEC Center's workshops, you'll see that we can kind of dig into this very, very deeply. But at this point, empathy and compassion, I'll talk about those. So empathy is really the ability to feel what it might feel like to be in somebody else's shoes. So what is it like to experience, really at an emotional level, what they're experiencing? So this is really important, that we are able to show a sense of empathy, and that's going to help us connect. Not only is it going to help us with our ability to really understand the individual, and of course that makes that connection feel stronger, but it's also going to show a sense of caring, a sense of concern for the individual. And that is really important as well, that we come in from that angle. If we come in from a different angle of just curiosity and intrusiveness without that connection, a lot of people are going to be kind of turned off by that. But if we come in from a sense of empathy and caring and warmness, that really changes the ability to truly have an open and honest dialogue. The thing about empathy is that it's a challenging thing, because we also have to take this into those conversations that are really hard for us. So there might be times where somebody has hurt us. And, you know, when we are hurt, probably our first reaction is to what? Guard ourselves, right? Or fight back. One of the two. And that obviously is not conducive for connection, having anything deeper there. So empathy really asks us to take a step back and realize that there's a whole lot that got that person to hurting you today. So an example of this is maybe somebody hurts me, says something that I see, maybe feel is really racist or something like that toward me. And I could, in that moment, shut down, walk away, be angry with that person, hold that anger for a long, long time. Or I could look at the situation and say, yes, that absolutely hurt. It didn't feel good. But there was a lot that went into this. They weren't just born way back when and said, you know what, in 2020, I'm going to hurt Brett Kawada really, really bad. No, it was their family experience, their personal experiences, their cultural experiences, their community experiences, the media, all of these things played into where they are today. And so by being able to understand that there wasn't intention from the very get-go to come here today and hurt me, that this was all built up throughout a lifetime, it really allows me to have empathy for that individual and say, boy, I sure am sorry that you had to go through so much horrible things to come to this point today where you actually were targeting me. That allows for empathy. That still allows for a connection. And you hope in that moment of connection, there's also growth on both sides. Works the other way as well. So if you happen to be the perpetrator, a lot of times we don't have the luxury of having really, really close folks who tell us that, boy, Brett, you know what? You really hurt me when you said this. If you do have that opportunity, it's super duper important that you take a step back and really think back to your own personal history and understand when this happened, why this happened, how this happened, and then think about how I want this to change going forward. So it really requires us to take a good, deep look at ourselves. And these are the most, oftentimes most uncomfortable moments. But through that sense of feeling uncomfortable, usually there's a lot of growth that comes out of that. So this really ties closely into Tervalon and Murray Garcia's original work, going back to that lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. The next piece is a sense of compassion. Being able to have compassion for an individual. So a lot of times we're walking through our world, and I do this very frequently. A lot of times I'm walking from my office to class, and I'm just kind of zipping down the hallway, flying past students. And I know that there's stuff happening around me, but I'm just kind of got my blinders on and I'm just going straight ahead. We have to be a little bit more aware of what's going on there. I think in this day and age with cell phones, people are glued to their cell phones as they're walking down. They're not seeing what's happening to the people around them. An example is there was a student, as I was kind of zipping to my office, it was right after class. I needed to get to my office, get my stuff for my next class, and then head out. But I saw a student there, his head was in his hands, and he looked like he was fairly distraught. So I sat down and I said, hey, is everything okay? And he said, yeah, everything's fine. And I said, really, if there's anything I can do, my office is just right around the corner. Please just knock on the door and let's just sit down and talk for a little bit. And he said, oh, yeah, sure, whatever, thanks. And I didn't think a whole lot of it. I didn't think, there was really much going on. But a couple months later, a month or two later, I couldn't remember exactly how long, the student shows up at my door. And I kind of recognized the student, but I didn't really know from where. And the student said, I just wanted to thank you. And I said, oh, well, you're welcome, but for what? And he said, you came up to me and you said, can you help? Is there anything that I could do? And you felt like you were really authentic when you said that. And I was thinking about killing myself that day, and I didn't, because I finally got the sense that somebody actually cared and saw that I was actually alive and here. So that little thing didn't take a whole lot of time, but potentially changed somebody's life. Was really, really kind of, to me, how powerful compassion can be. And so this idea of compassion and kindness is really important in fostering that connection so we can have authentic conversation around something that can be, especially in our culture and day and age, a very sensitive topic. But if we come from a place of curiosity, knowing knowing that we don't know, empathy and compassion, we have the ability to connect with the folks around us. We have the ability to do good work and really, really not only connect for the understanding, but also connection for community, that we can all kind of come together and work together. So that's, in a nutshell, empathy and compassion part of cultural humility. So all this together, cultural humility, empathy, and compassion, we call it CHEC. That's why our organization is called the CHEC Center. Check us out. Come and see one of our workshops. We also do a lot of work to go out to different organizations as well. And we get a lot deeper with this. This is just giving you a surface level introduction to a lot of the material we get into. So appreciate your time. Thank you. And we will see you in the future.